Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Well Said, where I interview policy experts, commentators, academics, students, activists, and others on topics of higher education, free speech, and related topics for American culture and policy. You can share this episode on Facebook or YouTube, as well as on any podcast platform such as Apple, Spotify, or Anchor, or even Ricochet now. So download the episode and listen anytime. If you like what you heard today, give our podcast a 5-star rating and go to our website, speechfirst.org, and press donate. So today on our show, I'm excited to have Professor David E. Bernstein join us. He holds a university professorship chair at the Antonin Scalia Law School of George Mason University. He has written a number of books, most recently Classified: The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America, and is very well known right now, especially speaking of some of the topics that we wanted to discuss regarding the legal questions around the anti-Semitic riots and protests that we've been seeing going on campus and the activity we've been seeing on college campuses. Of course, Professor Bernstein is not to be confused with one of our previous guests a few weeks ago, David L. Bernstein, who was on to talk about his book, Woke Anti-Semitism. Thank you so much, David, for joining us.
Thank you. And like I say, he's the other David Bernstein.
He's the other.
Sometimes he'll call me the other David Bernstein, but I say he's the other David Bernstein.
Right. Okay. So today, like I mentioned, we're gonna touch on a really salient topic. After October 7th, there have been a widespread disappointment, I think, in the way universities have chosen to respond to Hamas's horrific attacks on innocent Israeli civilians, as well as the mounting evidence that anti-Semitism has been festering on campuses for years now, and is reaching a breaking point. From alumni, major donors, prospective employers, and the general public, universities are being called out for their dereliction of taking a strong stance against terrorism and the killing of innocent Israelis. So a few weeks ago, like I mentioned, we had David L. Bernstein on to discuss the origins of anti-Semitism and kind of like woke culture, woke ideology, and talked about like why on campuses it was so ideologically difficult for university leadership to simply condemn terrorism. Today, I hope to discuss with our guests many of the legal questions that have arisen over the last weeks regarding what is protected speech and what is not. Further, I would love to get your reaction, David, to these attempts of DEI departments to essentially draw these moral equivalencies between what pro-Palestinian or anti-Semitic protesters are calling for, and kind of those equivalencies that they try to draw between some of the rhetoric out of conservative students expressing their views on political and social issues of the day, such as, the LGBTQ questions and transgenders in sports and whatnot. We don't have to talk about that issue specifically, but I think it's important to recognize that many of the universities right now are struggling with the fact that their DEI departments for years now have been essentially saying that all of the rhetoric on the right is violence. All speech, all of that type of speech is violence. It's causing mental harm to a lot of these students of these various communities. And therefore, they're going to try to tamp down on it, restrict it in various ways. Obviously, most of those methods have been, at Speech First, we say are unconstitutional and violate students' free speech rights. But that attempt to say that speech is violence, and now we're seeing an issue where DEI departments are struggling to handle and kind of square that similar issue, but with Jewish students. You don't see, for example, LGBTQ students or liberal students having to be escorted to their dorms by campus security. And oftentimes, you don't see those types of students when you're looking at like what type of protests we're seeing. You don't see them being calm and collected when they're gathering. Instead, they're often the ones that are calling for the most aggressive and violent actions in a lot of these scenarios, especially now when we're seing pro-Israel speakers or Jewish speakers come to campuses. It's kind of escalating the situations. So in laying all of that out to you, David, I would like to start off with just kind of getting your initial reaction to how universities reacted on and what they're essentially like what the university leadership did in reaction to October 7th. And then we can kind of just go from there because there's a lot to talk about here.
Sure. Look, in my opinion, university leaders should not take positions on issues of public importance that aren't directly related to things going on at the university itself. Not, we have, Black students, so we're concerned about George Floyd, or Jewish students, so we're concerned about like things that are actually internal to the university. They shouldn't be taking positions. University should be places of open inquiry and without official dogmas or ideologies. That said, that has not been the policy of major universities for quite a while. And university presidents have taken public positions on racism in the United States, police violence, Ukraine versus Russia, all sorts of ongoing things that are not directly related to university functions. So once they take on that role that they're serving in their mind as the moral conscience, they're being moral leaders, then they could be expected to take, if something happens like horrific terrorist attack on Israelis, they should be expected to unconditionally condemn these attacks like they've condemned other things in the past, and many of them fail to do so. And they are properly called out for that. Now, at some places like my university, the president's reaction was, well, I called it out a little bit, but I don't want to take positions on public issues. After all, it's controversial and people have different views. I was like, well, okay, I would be perfectly okay with that sort of reaction if university presidents would say, I have taken positions in the past. That was sort of what the trend among university presidents. And now that we have this very controversial issue where people have very high emotions, I've really sat down and thought about what the role of the university should be. And we really shouldn't be taking positions on these things. I know it's an awkward time to make that sort of decision, and I understand that, but from now on, I regret doing it in the past, and I won't do it again in the future. Instead, they're saying, like my university president, Gregory Washington, well, I'm not going to apologize for taking positions in the past, and I'm not going to promise not to do it in the future. I'm just not going to do it here. Which is just completely unacceptable. As far it's like, right. Well, that just means that really isn't a principled position at all. That means that you want to be able to say your piece on things and you just don't want to do it here, and therefore you're being properly condemned. And the other aspect of this is that even if a university was to take the position, we don't comment on what goes on in Gaza and Israel because it's outside sphere. What about what's going on the university itself? If right. There are people chanting pro-Hamas, pro-genocide slogans, pro-terrorism slogans, like globalized intifada, I think even under a pretty strict idea that universities shouldn't be commenting on global events or even taking positions on campus, that there is certain rhetoric that is so hateful that it would be fine for university presidents to say, even if the speech is protected by the First Amendment at a public university or by our rules at a private university, I want to disassociate the university from this and say this is not acceptable rhetoric, morally speaking.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Suddenly, all of a sudden, they're discovering their institutional neutrality on many of these issues because they actually have a preference. They're just either afraid to say it, or they worry that their position could, get them in trouble with like the woke mob or various donors. So there was a hesitancy. I guess most people, though, like most Americans, can look at this and simply say, like, yeah, terrorists are bad, right? Like we condemn terrorism. And if the university doesn't want to take any positions, like you're right, in that they are not going to say anything because it's outside of their scope. I think the biggest issue here is suddenly this has come up on their campus. This is now a campus issue. This is now a campus problem. So they have to comment on it in one way or another, whether it be, okay, now all of a sudden we're institutionally neutral and we are pro-free speech. So you guys can say all your pro-terrorist rhetoric that you want. Or, they can, but that contradicts, though, there already previously existing not only statements, but also many policies about what students are allowed to do when it comes to causing mental harm. Like a lot of universities have harassment policies that actually say, if you, obviously we've challenged this at Speech First, saying that these are policies that violate students' free speech rights, but many policies still exist to this day, even in private schools, where you can't use language or you can't make statements that are essentially biased or offensive to certain groups or are microaggressive or, hurt students' mental stability in some way or another. So I guess what's your reaction to how the universities, or maybe suggestions on how the universities should be reacting to the type of mental disturbance and emotional disturbance that Jewish students are currently feeling when they hear their peers and sometimes faculty using statements that are statements used by terrorist organizations against Jews around the world. So, like, what should universities be doing here in this situation?
Well, I think there, getting to the legal aspects, as I'm here as a legal expert. Again, I don't think universities inherently have an obligation to speak up on these things. But the problem is, if they do have these policies, or they do have a practice of condemning like microaggressions and so forth, shutting down there are all these cases over the last few years where someone thought they saw something that looked like a noose, and it just turned out to be like, something that happened to look like a noose, but was there for some other reason or whatever. And they shut down the university and had teach-ins and so forth because this suggests violence against Black people, even though is either a hoax or not really a news. And then people chant globalize the Intifada or surround the Hillel building in a threatening manner and chant, from the river to the sea, even when the Hillel group is not specifically even doing anything about Israel. And then they don't do anything. That's problematic because I think there are two aspects to federal civil rights law in this regard. One aspect is that you're not allowed to you can't permit a hostile environment for a protective group, which includes Jews, at least as an ethnic group, if not a religious group, because the law doesn't cover religion. And that is, that's kind of somewhat dangerous and problematic because it leads to the kind of policies that you guys are fighting, which is, we don't want microaggressions that might lead to a hostile environment. But I think the second thing, which has gotten less attention, although I've seen some complaints have now been filed on this, focusing on this particular issue, is that regardless of what policies are in place, Jewish students are entitled to equal protection with regard to how the university handles things. So if the university is going to shut down over an alleged noose that wasn't, but isn't going to even make a statement when people are chanting genocidal threats or saying nasty things to Jewish classmates and so forth, that raises the issue of not what should the policy be, which is a separate issue with regard to hostile environment aggressions, but when do you decide that there is sufficient hostility to a particular group of students to act? And if the barrier is much higher to saying something or doing something on behalf of Jewish students than it is to other protected minority groups, that I think is a violation of civil rights law by itself, because now you're discriminating against the Jewish students. You're saying merely, for example, a professor merely uttering the N-word in class when quoting a case, right, which gets strong condemnation, even though it wasn't meant in any kind of derogatory way. Here's what the person said in this hate speech case, should we allow it? And they actually say the word. I'm not going to say the word.
Right, and they'd be fired. Or what about
they get fired? It depends on the university, but they get reprimanded. There's a case in Georgia where the professor was put on unpaid leave and demanded they go to sensitivity training and this and that. But then other people will make much more dramatically violent, derogatory statements regarding Jews or Israelis, and the university just shrugs. So even if you think the university should just shrug as a policy matter, the fact that they're not shrugging for certain groups but shrugging for others is a discrimination problem.
Yeah, and I think another example that supports that as well is there was an adjunct professor, I forget which university it was, that was fired for in an arts class for showing a piece of art, I think, that depicted Muhammad. And that, got them fired from their job. That was kind of like a no questions asked scenario. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a number of situations that we can point to, examples on campuses where there's been essentially discriminatory application of the current campus policies when it comes to these like microaggressions or whatever kind of hate speech rules schools want to have. Now, before even going into the free speech side, what are your thoughts on just I'm curious because this is coming up a lot, especially amongst various conservatives and folks who are trying to dive into this. What are your thoughts on the fact that there's already a claim that these policies are misapplied or applied in a discriminatory way against white men, essentially on campuses as well, in addition to like Jewish students in this situation. But this is another situation. People are like, they're not feeling the sympathy there are a lot who are not feeling the sympathy for Jews. And I've heard a number of claims on this front, just because they're like, well, schools have been acting this way towards white people on campus all the time. They've already had freshman orientations where they say all the white people are racist. And this is kind of where I think within the Jewish community, everyone's kind of like, well, maybe you guys have been voting for the wrong party this whole time, or maybe you guys have been kind of, marching with the wrong people this whole time, because they kind of put you at the top of that privilege pyramid anyway. But there's a lot of kind of talk around this with white, basically anti-racism or racism against white people. So I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts on that, or if you've seen any kind of legal questions come up around it.
Sure. Well, look, as the other David Bernstein, I'm sure, related to you, the woke ideology is in fact behind a lot of this, and it's a completely fair comment to say that the hostility to Jews is, to a large extent, just a manifestation of hostility to anyone except for the groups that the woke left has decided deserve to be protected. I mean, in fairness to the Jews, among whom I am, when you're 2% of the population and you've suffered violence, and your synagogues and schools and community centers have to have armed guards because there have been terrorist incidents, you're going to be more sensitive to people chanting genocidal slogans and so forth than if you're a white male or a white woman and you're like complying 60% of the population and so forth. I mean, there's a different level of vulnerability. So of course, it's easier to shrug off someone saying, we don't like white people because what are they going to do about it when whites are 60% of the population? We don't like Jewish people and we're kind of violent about it. That's actually seems like much more of a threat. But I think one thing that was obvious to me. I mean, I've always been on team woke is bad. So it's not like I've converted, but some people who aren't really paying that much attention, they're like, oh, well, what's wrong with diversity, inclusion, and equity? These are all nice concepts. The right wing is just complaining because they don't want to deal with our history, this and that. So I think one thing that we need to recognize is that DEI offices are not about diversity, equity, and especially not inclusion. You won't see any DEI office anywhere ever say, boy, we have a couple of students this year coming from the rural South, from evangelical backgrounds, and they're probably going to feel really uncomfortable being here at Brown University with, everything that goes on at somewhere like Brown University. So we should, work with them, help them, make sure they feel comfortable. No one cares about that. The purpose of DEI, in my opinion, and I think this is empirically validated, is to make sure that every major corporation, government office, university in the country, there is a fixed constituency for promoting left-wing ideology and specifically through a left-wing interpretation of what the interests of particular minority groups that the woke favor. And it's not, and if you're not in those groups or you're not left-wing, you are not included. Now, I will, just as a caveat, there are some really nice, sincere DI people out there who don't buy into this ideology and really do want to have inclusion, but that's not primarily what DEI is about in practice. DEI isn't about, we want to promote this ideology that, there's the oppressed class and the oppressor class, and the oppressed class can do whatever they want, and the oppressor class is inherently evil. And this, by the way, I should say this relates very much to the general conflict between Hamas and Israel and the reaction on campus. You say, well, how could anyone be defending, let's talk, you think about Israel, how could anyone be defending what Hamas did on October 7th? When you read about the brutality of the attacks, the gleefulness in which the brutality was engaged in. And the answer is, well, they have decided for ideological reasons that Israelis are the oppressor class and Palestinians are the oppressed. And under this, we call it here woke, but the more general term used internationally is decolonization. So they're engaging in decolonization. And if you're the colonized, if you're the oppressed, that is the Palestinians, everything you do could either be excused or you're not responsible for it. The forces of history are just playing out. So we don't look, morally speaking, oh, you raped someone, you threw a baby in the oven. That's about, you're just the colonized, so we can't blame you for what you do. On the other hand, if you're the oppressor, you're not allowed to defend yourself at all, and anything that happens to you, you deserve. So not only does so when the 33 Harvard organization says the blame for this lies totally on Israel, it's because they're the oppressor. There's no individual morality, there's no sense of individual rights, natural rights. It's a complete attack on the entire Western tradition, essentially, in favor of a invented racial hierarchy in which essentially anyone who's deemed the oppressor, which is generally associated with being white, is immoral and bad, and the other side is good, and nothing else matters, really.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're absolutely right touching on this kind of this concept, the ends justifying the means, and I think this is very much a part of kind of the woke or the left ideology, and they believe that it doesn't really, like you said, most of it doesn't really matter if it's violence or if it's shutting down speech or any of these other tactics we've seen them use, like just disobeying the laws. They believe that that is justified because they are the victims here and they're the press, so they get to essentially set the stage. They get to set the standards as the victims. Well, let's talk about some of the reactions that we have seen, because there was a question that came up, especially when we had certain law firms. Let's see, certain law firms and other kind of prospective employers essentially withdrawing, offers from students who came out and signed some of these letters, like at Harvard University, where they signed letters being, supporting what Hamas did and being, saying that they are pro-Palestine and that they, Israel brought this on themselves, essentially. And then prospective employers essentially withdrawing their offers, and students seeing this as retaliatory, right? So I guess my question is on the legal front, and this has kind of come up a couple times with folks who've reached out to us asking about this. What are some of the laws around like political retaliation? Because obviously when you're looking at a private institute or a private organization saying that like they don't want to be affiliated with a certain political viewpoint, that's completely, something that I think they're free to do. But where are the lines essentially with political retaliation when it comes to private or public entities?
For public entities, it's much more complicated. The essential test would be something along the lines of, is what you said interfering somehow with your job, right? So if you said something, I think actually, as much as I'm a sort of a speech libertarian, if you're a police officer and you're seen in a mixed race community and you're seen walking around in KKK robes at a rally, it's not that we want to crack down your political speech, but how could Black people in the community now trust you to implement the law fairly? So you've now really undermined your ability to do your job, right? So I think there's obviously a line in that regard. For private entities, they could generally fire whoever they want for whatever reason, but there are some states like California that ban discrimination based on political views or affiliations. And there are different laws in different states. My friend Eugene Volokh is sort of an expert on this, but so that could be a limitation. But I think, again, it's an interesting, my own perspective on this is that some of the, well, I have a few things to say about this. First of all, there's something that people say that are sufficiently offensive that, I would question your judgment and whether I want to be your colleague or have you in my office. Sometimes there have been like ridiculously minor things that someone was caught, like, in some case involving some truck driver who they said gave a racist salute or something that it really wasn't, and he got fired immediately anyway. So some things are bogus. I think we should generally want a culture where you could express your views on things without worrying about losing your job. But I have a few caveats to that. One caveat for that is I have exactly zero sympathy for the pro-Palestinian movement in this regard, because for the last 20 years or so, they've been pushing something called boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
Right, exactly.
Which includes essentially deplatforming people who they deem to be too pro-Israel. They put it in terms of people who have views that are contrary to international law, but their interpretation of international law and what international law really is are quite distinct. And basically, they want to boycott anyone who's pro-Israel ultimately, or even in the case there were a whole bunch of, look, let's take Berkeley Law School. Berkeley Law School last year made the news because 10 organizations at Berkeley signed a statement that they would not invite any Zionist speakers to any event, not about Israel. Like they have the right to say we're anti-Israel, so we want a pro-Israel speaker. But even if they're going to be talking about domestic violence in the United States, we will not hire anyone who's a Zionist, which they acknowledged on further questioning would include, for example, their dean, Erwin Chemerinsky, who is very, very, very left-wing on everything, including Israel, but still thinks Israel should exist. That's not good enough for them. So they're boycotting essentially almost all Jews,
Right.
among others. And then they turn around and have sort of the chutzpah to say, oh, but how dare you decide that we say things and you want to boycott us? So, in a sense, they're getting the just desserts because they were leading edge of boycotting people for their views, trying to get people fired for their views, trying to get people in trouble for their views. People even complained to my university about me tweeting things they didn't like, right? And then they'll turn around and say, oh, but we have to be masked because people may retaliate against us. Fortunately, my university is not pursuing it because they understand it's my First Amendment rights here. It wasn't anything offensive really to any objective observer, just something they didn't like. So in any event, so I've like zero sympathy for them now all of a sudden becoming free speech libertarians, right? Maybe so there's this really interesting issue. Should we take this opportunity, as people believe in speech, and say, let's adopt the principle that in general, unless you say something totally horrible. Like, it's one thing to say we think Israel brought about itself by having bad policies. That's offensive to me, but I don't think it's like hateful as such. So yes, these are terrible atrocities. We condemn Hamas, but Israel is inviting this by its terrible policies. All right, that's your political opinion of what the ultimate cause is. But then if you say, but on the other hand, I endorse the atrocities. I have a picture of the paragliders. Let's do more of this. That strikes me as being outside the realm of human moral basic morals. I don't want to associate you. But we can have a policy like that. And we should also have a policy. One thing that really troubled me about what was previously mostly the woke getting people in trouble or fired is there was no grace involved. I understand, and we should all understand, that sometimes people's emotions are running high, or sometimes they misword something that they unwritten, that if they had been thinking about more, they wouldn't have chosen those words. And sometimes those people have been called out and they apologize immediately. And there's no grace whatsoever. No, you said this. So my friend Ilya Shapiro, who is supposed to start as a professor at Georgetown, he said something like, I don't remember the exact wording, but basically the point he was making was that that Joe Biden promised to appoint a black woman to the Supreme Court. It's too bad he did that because he thinks his other judge would have been a better judge. He phrased it kind of awkwardly, but that was obviously the point. There was nothing especially offensive about it. But and he apologized immediately for the way he phrased it awkwardly. And still, he was investigated for 3 months. It's okay, we're willing to still hire you, but you have to be like subject to all these restrictions. And he just resigned. But that sort of thing strikes me as very bad, not so much because a private university shouldn't have the right to associate with whoever it wants to. In that case, there were academic freedom issues. But I am willing to give grace to someone who they say, I did say that it was awkwardly phrased. Here's what I meant. Or, in retrospect, I was just feeling very emotional at the moment. And now I regret I said that. And even though it strikes you as really offensive, give me another chance. And I think we should all do that. Because, look, if we all recorded, if we had a video and audio recorded going 24/7, as now some of us do with Twitter and whatnot, the odds that at some point we won't say something offensive to somebody that we, in a moment of anger or a moment of emotion or just awkwardly phrased is very slim. That's something I told my dean when we had a little bit of an incident at the university, not involving me, but so we really need to stand up for the free speech rights of my colleagues. Because look, I teach evidence. I teach constitutional law. Last semester, I covered child molestation, child rape, adult rape, abortion, homosexual rights, LGBT rights, segregation, go on and on, like all the
very controversial issues. Yeah.
All right. All the most hot button topics you can imagine between the two classes. And the odds that I've been teaching already 28 and a half years. I hope to be teaching about 20 more. So of course, almost a 50-year career. What are the odds that at some point, if someone, takes something I said out of context, it won't sound extremely offensive? So we should all have some grace about these things. Even in someone who, says something horrible about Hamas, I'm willing to give them grace and say, I was just hot into the collar at the moment, and I really should have said that. I don't really believe that. I'm willing to say, okay.
Yeah. Well, I think in these cases too, which makes it even more damning for the students, though, is that they signed a statement, they signed a letter, which isn't just kind of like a one-off, like angry tweet. It's something that they would have had to. Now they claim that they didn't see the letter, but I don't understand why you wouldn't disassociate yourself with the organization if you saw your leadership signing that, or tried to to do something about the club status on campus, and that like I want to force our leadership to step down and resign because they signed something without consulting the rest of the group. But there was none of that. But these students still essentially the understanding is you read this and you agreed to this full statement by signing your name and your club's name in support of it. So I think that tells like these law firms and whatnot and other folks who were looking at hiring these students something that like, no, they've actually thought deeply about this and this is how they feel. And I don't want you, like you said, to have someone who is going to bring that drama, that craziness to my office. I think that's going to create serious issues internally, and it can create serious issues with our cases that we're handling. So yeah, I'm kind of curious if you have any additional thoughts on kind of like this claim that this is a political retaliation, essentially.
There was at least one case where I thought was very unfair, where someone was running I forget exactly, he was running some magazine or something, and he retweeted some not very funny satirical headline from The Onion about it sort of took the Palestinian side. I thought that was extreme, although apparently he had a history of this sort of thing. So maybe it wasn't extreme in context. But look, this is a very difficult issue for free society. I think having a general liberal free speech culture where we interpret what people say and do generously and don't immediately try to fire people, get them canceled and so forth is a healthy thing for democracy, for a liberal society. On the other hand, if you say things that are so far outside the bounds of normal morality, I mean, if you really if you've shown that you buy into this decolonization narrative, I wouldn't hire you on that basis. I don't care if it's Palestinian or not. You really think basically, essentially, white people are. I mean, I actually have been tweeting about this because something that's really struck me and occurred to me. We had in past generations, we had these various communist sympathizers or actual communists who would defend Stalin, defend Mao, defend Castro, and that was really bad. But if you ask them, and I had some elderly relatives who are communists, so I spoke to one of them before she died, my great aunt. She goes, well, they promised us a utopian worker society. So at least you could say, well, they had terrible moral instincts here, but at least the goal was they thought this was worthwhile for the goal of this workers' paradise that would be achieved. But what are the woke promising, or the decolonizers promising? All they're promising is that instead of Israelis running what they call Palestine, Palestinians will run it. Does it matter how the Palestinians run it? No. So you have this weird phenomenon of queers for Palestine or queers for Hamas even. And you ask them, but they'd throw you off buildings or murder you immediately if they knew you were gay or trans. Like, well, that doesn't matter because the goal is just decolonization. So this is a really crazy, immoral ideology. It makes you wonder how such a person would get along in the world with people who disagree with them. Because if you really think that, I don't care who's running, I don't care what the policies are, how oppressive they are, how discriminatory they are, as long as it's people I consider brown running it instead of people I consider white. I say consider because, of course, Israelis are no more or less white in fact than Arabs are. Both are of Middle Eastern origin, right? So if you believe that, I don't see, there's a reason why people with these ideologies tend to wind up working at universities or in left-wing foundations or in DEI offices, because they can't function in normal society with their extreme ideology. They can only function being around people like themselves.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. I think it's very telling on the mental state or even just the irrationality of thought. Like, I mean, you're asking yourself as a prospective employer, I mean, we all want to know if people we're going to hire, are going to be rational thinkers. That plays a huge role in the success of the organization or the institution. Okay, great. Let's move on because I want to talk a little about some of these investigations that are happening with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights on Title VI. You touched on this a little bit earlier with the discriminatory kind of enforcement of the policies, but I'm curious if you have any additional thoughts on what now the Department of Education has announced. I believe it's 6 universities, and Cornell and Columbia University are both included on that list. And we can talk about some specific situations that we saw too, and get your thoughts on kind of the legal implications here and maybe possible other Title VI implications.
Well, I think the easiest one, which to me is the most egregious and easiest one, involves Wellesley College, because they're the head of the residence advisory The students who live in the dorms, the older students who help supervise the dorm, and are there to help make the students all feel comfortable and happy. That's like their job. Sent out after October 7th an email on behalf of her and the rest of the resident staff saying that Zionism has no place. Zionism and Zionists, I think, have no place at Wellesley College, which, the vast majority of Jewish students identify as such. So they're basically saying Jews have no place. And there was a little bit of an uproar. The president tried to quash it by having the student apologize. But the apology was really one of these, I'm sorry you were offended apologies, as opposed to actual apology. They tried to move on, and they did not fire the student or the other students who were doing this. It seems to me that if hostile environment law means anything, imagine if a resident advisor, and this isn't even as egregious in a way because there's more of a split of opinion. Imagine if a resident advisor had said, there's no place for people who support affirmative action at our law school, at our university. Right. Obviously that would be seen as expressing hostility towards Black students, even though not all Black students are in favor of affirmative action, not all white students are against it. Still, would be obviously be a signal being sent of who we want. And that resident advisor would be out the door and packing their bags, looking for somewhere else to live very, very quickly. And they didn't do that at Wellesley. And I think that it's sort of an open and shut case that allowing these students to stay in that role is creating a hostile environment, legally speaking. In
that case specifically, I do want to pull on one thread here because you mentioned, because we talked about this a couple of times already with the Zionist phrasing. So what I've kind of seen and what I think has been happening is most of these students use the phrase Zionism as a way to sidestep the anti-Semitism question by trying to make it, they're saying that Zionist is a political position. By identifying, essentially making Zionism a political position, it allows them to essentially cloak their anti-Semitism and really being critical of what they see as a political position. How much of this do you think that's actually the attempts there, and that they truly just anti-Semitic and they're just using the Zionism phrasing to hide it? And how much of that do you believe is actual just genuine ignorance on the issue and on the phrasing and what it actually means when they say Zionist?
Yeah, so let me take one step back before I answer your question. So I want to add about the Wellesley situation.
Yeah.
And the only reason that one is especially egregious is this isn't just students doing it. They were school employees speaking as school employees. So that makes the university responsible for their speech. This isn't the student is the student. Should we allow hostile environment claims when it's just a student saying something to another student? This is university employees speaking in their role as university employees, which makes the university responsible for their speech.
Right.
But to your question, look, that is a complicated question. But for the kind of people who talk about structural racism, we could certainly say a structural anti-Zionism. You have to ask yourself, why of all the causes in the world that you could hit upon are people so focused on what's going on in Israel? Why people who claim to be pro-Palestinian or just worried about civilian casualties and so on don't care about what's going on in all over the world, but even in Arab countries? Yemen, 350,000 people have died. Sudan has this terrible war going on with hundreds of thousands of people dying, tons of refugees. Syria, in the civil war recently, even the Palestinians were suffering. Some Palestinian, thousands of Palestinians were killed by Assad, along with 500,000 other people, and no one cared. And if you think that this has nothing to do with the fact that Israel is a Jewish country, and that there's been a longstanding anti-Semitic campaign, I don't want to plead, I don't want to see Jews as perpetual victims or claim victimization as such, but you have to, there is context to these things.
Yeah.
And the context is that Jews have been subject to institutional anti-Semitism, not just from society, but state-sponsored anti-Semitism was intentionally spread into the Arab world, first by the Nazis, then by the Soviets, then the Arab countries themselves would, you go to their book fairs, are selling the classic anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Iran is a state-sponsored anti-Semitism. So to think, it's just coincidence, though, they're all going after the Jews, right? That beggars the imagination. So my guess, though, so I think some students are perfectly aware of this. Some students interestingly, in my opinion, or at least some of the leadership, they understand this is creating a hostile environment for Jews, and they welcome that. It's not uh, a side effect that is unfortunate. And the reason for that is not necessarily they hate Jews as such, but while people, especially people on the right, I interact with people like this all the time, think that Jews are somehow behind all the radicalism in the US. It used to be 50 years ago that a good part of the radical left of the United States is Jewish. Now Jews are not an especially large part of the radical left, and Jews are much more likely in the university context to be part of the establishment. At one point recently, all 8 Ivy League presidents were Jewish, and a very large percent of the student body at these institutions was Jewish. It's much lower now. And in other words, Jews were the establishment. And if you want to get the favored minorities and the favored leftist ideological folks to take over the universities, Jews are in the way. And if you make Harvard, if you make Wellesley, if you make NYU, if you make Columbia, if you make Penn a hostile environment for Jews, that gets them out of the way and allows the people they want to take over to take over. So we have to understand that anti-Semitism in general is less often, oh, I dislike Jews as individuals, right, and more, how could I use centuries old hatred for Jews in Islamic and Western society to pursue my political agenda.
Right. No, I think that's an excellent point. I think it does touch on why there's such a level of ignorance amongst some of these students who are kind of just going along for the ride because they just identify with the decolonization group and they don't even ask themselves what that means or what that looks like.
Yeah, I just want to add to that one last thing. The other thing is, I admire groups like Speech First and FIRE and all that for fighting for speech on campus, but necessarily a lot of this is reactive. The universities have public policies or treated someone publicly badly. The broader speech problem in universities is that university administrations have allowed radical faculty to take over entire departments. And then if you don't agree with the underlying ideology, you'll never get a job there. So so if a student is interested in, hey, Israel, Palestine, I'm kind of left-leaning, what's going on? And they take classes at your average university, they'll never hear the Zionist or pro-Israel or even neutral perspective. They'll get the whole decolonization thing. And they'll think that's the only thing. I mean, one thing I've definitely noticed participating in public debates in Twitter and elsewhere is I think almost any pro-Israel advocate in the United States could articulate the Palestinian position pretty well and pretty neutrally. And basically the Jews were sent by the Europeans to colonize the land and don't belong here and should leave. That and the land belongs to us. It's a very simple position, but it's easy to articulate. But if you ask the other side to articulate the Jewish position, they'll say, oh, Jews, it's Jewish supremacy. They believe Jews are God's chosen people and should control everything. Or they think that, oh, Jews are whites, it's white supremacy. Like all sorts of nonsense that no one who's actually pro-Israel would ever actually say, because that's what they're taught in their classes. That's the only perspective they get.
No, that's absolutely true. And this has been an issue on just multiple fronts that we've seen is there's no debate, there's no open discussion, there's no equal representation of viewpoints, or even just like a diversity, just generally of viewpoints on college campuses. You have seen, I've talked to a number of faculty members who have had to leave teaching because they couldn't see themselves, they couldn't get tenure in their departments. They just couldn't get ahead in their departments because they were too divergent from department leadership, who were very much kind of on the DEI train. So I think you're touching on something that has been just widely just a bigger issue when we're talking about academic institutions and educating students, like the debate, discussion, open inquiry concepts. Like these are some serious defaults right now in the academy that we're struggling to rectify. Let's talk about some of the specific incidents because I'm curious to get your take on these. One in particular, because you talked about hostile environment law. So a lot of people right now are trying to are when we're talking about whether the protest should be allowed, everyone touches on kind of like, oh, this is free expression. They should be allowed to do this. But I think you introduced a very interesting point here of what's creating a hostile environment, because I mentioned this earlier in that you have many students who claim mental harm just because like a conservative speaker comes to campus. So they see that as an excuse to throw rocks and break windows and light effigies on fire of the speaker and to shout speakers down and to stop them from speaking. But that's never considered a hostile environment. Those students are rarely punished, if at all, held accountable for their actions, and any faculty who help with that are usually not held accountable either. But what about these situations against Jewish students right now? So we've seen, I think it was Harvard University. There were a number of Jewish students who were, in my opinion, like physically assaulted. It looks like they were being, the other students were holding up the Hamas scarves and essentially like trying to surround the other students with these scarves, and they were touching them and kind of pushing them around with the scarves. And so there was that incident. There was the incident at Columbia University, which I think is under full investigation. I believe the student might have actually been charged with a hate crime. She physically assaulted a student for trying to stop her from taking down flyers of the kidnapping victims. Cornell University, there was an investigation where students because a student actually like made real threats. And that's kind of one of the things I would like you to talk about a little bit too, in addition to hostile environment law, the true threat idea or inciting violence, because there's a kind of a fine line there, at least my understanding is, and there's not a whole lot of like really descriptive precedent, but I'd like to get your thoughts on all of like, when are these lines crossed in these situations? What are other situations that you've seen where the lines are not clear? If you want to go ahead and get us started.
Sure. I mean, any kind of unwelcome physical contact is clearly illegal. It's not protected as speech. That's easy. I don't think it's a particularly difficult issue, but universities seem to have trouble dealing with it. There have been a bunch of incidents where Jewish students have had to be escorted out the back exit or hidden in the way because of a perceived violent mob or potentially violent mob. And my opinion is that if the police, exercising their reasonable judgment, think that you can't go about your normal business without potentially being assaulted or causing a riot, that is a true threat. And the students should be told, who are threatening in that way, should be told they need to disperse, or they will be at least brought up on university charges and perhaps also arrested, right? And again, say, well, how do you know they're really in danger? If the police are telling you that you have to leave out the back exit for your safety. Now, the police could handle this other ways. Maybe I think part of it is the police try to avoid any kind of confrontations. So maybe the police should first tell the students outside, look, we have Jewish students here. You're not permitted to threaten them in any way. I want you to disperse enough to let them all out safely, not yell at them, not do anything threatening to them. And then if they decline to do it, instead of just immediately going, let's bring the charge. I mean, my view is, I say, I'm never going out of back exit. If you tell me there's a mob out there, I want you to be safe. I'm saying you are the police. You're here to protect me. If it's really a mob that threatens my safety, you need to disperse them. You need to threaten them with punishment until they leave. And if not, I'm taking my baseball bat and going out the front door. Right. But most students are not. I'm a Queens kid, so I'm a little less shy about this sort of thing. But anyway, so there's that. And I agree in general that like the snowflakey personality just says, oh my God, someone's speaking on something I disagree with. It's assaulting my humanity. Tough. You live in a free society. You have to hear things you don't agree with. What's disturbing me about, without knowing all the details, what's disturbing me about stories I'm hearing from people I know, people who are not, left-wing snowflakes, is that their kids' grades are plummeting. They're so upset about what's going on campus and they feel so threatened. Some people have sent their kids have said, I feel so unsafe on my campus that I am going home, and they're given permission to take their classes on Zoom for the rest of the semester. I have a friend who, I think NYU may actually be the single worst school for anti-Semitism right now, which is ironic because when I was a kid, it was like 80% Jewish, but not anymore. And his daughter was the other students in her program were referring to her as a little Jew bitch, and the university administrators weren't doing anything about it. So I'm not ruling out the possibility that some of the students who say they feel actually threatened are exaggerating and just are sort of, maybe, don't have much fortitude, and it's kind of like it shouldn't bother them as much as it did. I'm hearing enough stories from enough places about kids who don't seem to fall into that category that say, this is a real hostile environment. This isn't someone saying, maybe we shouldn't be so quick to give life, puberty altering drugs to 12-year-olds, and trans activists saying, "Oh my God, they're assaulting my humanity. I can't live." That's ridiculous. But people who are saying, I actually personally feel so physically threatened that I'm afraid to walk to my classes, then I want to take my class from home. That strikes me as, and maybe it's even, I feel so emotionally threatened. I can't go to my class without students whispering behind my back, making nasty remarks that they know I could overhear, basically, essentially harassing me, although not any individual harassing me sufficiently that could file charges against that individual, right? That seems like the kind of thing that should at least be investigated, especially to the extent that students are saying, hey, going to the civil rights office of the university or going to the dean saying, "Hey, this is what's happening. What are you doing about it?" And they're not doing anything about it. Whereas clearly, if it was other minority, again, there's the two issues there. One is it truly a hostile environment, legally speaking? And the second is, even if it's not quite a true environment, legally speaking, are you discriminating against Jewish students by not taking these incidents nearly as seriously as you would take them if they happened to other students?
Right. So that's I think that one is easier to prove because there's so much evidence of universities trying to enforce these types of policies against other students for supposedly like mentally harming minority students with or transgender students with their rhetoric. But I think in the harmful environment one, so I'll give you a couple examples and you can tell me if these kind of qualify based on kind of like what legal standards are. So when these protesters, for example, or these pro-Palestinian rallies turn into marches on campus where they specifically are trying to identify where the Hillel office is on campus, and they like try to get in or surround the Hillel office, knowing that that's where the Jewish students tend to congregate on campus. Another incident where students are sitting at tables and they have kippahs on, and outside the windows you have these protesters kind of like banging on the windows and yelling things at them about, what Israel is responsible for or whatnot. Or obviously, we've seen more threatening incidents with the one with Cooper Union College in New York City is under investigation by Department of Education for this, for students having to basically lock themselves in the library. And I think campus security in that case did tell them not to leave the library and to just stay in there, or some administrator told them not to leave. So I guess in those types of situations, you're right in that, is it technically, is it hostile environment when the students can't go about their regular activities, or does it require security to get involved? Like what is the bar, what's the standard here, if there even is one?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that if security has to get involved and you can't go about your daily activities, that's not even so much hostile environment. That is, you are being deprived of normal educational benefits based on
that's harassment.
ethnicity.
Yeah.
But for the first cases, I mean, look, I think that theoretically speaking, at what level is holding a protest specifically outside of Hillel or whatnot, hostile environment is an interesting theoretical question. But I am 100% confident that if a bunch of non-Muslim students, after, let's say, there were some Islamic terrorist attack somewhere in the United States, surrounded the Islamic Center and started chanting anti-Muslims, or just tried chanting, death to the terrorists, terrorists should go back where they came from, not specifically targeting the Muslim students, but enough that's obviously aimed at them. Or if they saw students wearing hijabs or other Islamic gear, would bang on them or say nasty things to them, I have zero doubt that universities would kick the disciplinary process into effect very quickly. So again, we can argue in theory what level of protest should trigger hostile environment or other claims, but I'm, and I know this may be difficult to prove because you're proving a counterfactual.
Right.
But what would have happened if it was another group? But we all know that this behavior would not be tolerated or considered acceptable in the universities if it was another group.
Yeah, and I think on proving the counterfactual, the real evidence there is just, I think there is a lot of evidence with the DEI departments these days, because they have plenty of ridiculous policies that they've enforced against conservative or libertarian students on college campuses for, holding tabling events or other major events, or even their own rallies or free speech balls or whatever. They've said those are all threats to students, essentially, right? So I think there's some evidence, or there's plenty of evidence on that front that you wouldn't necessarily be proving the counterfactual itself, but you could show evidence that it certainly would be possible. So no, I think it's a really interesting legal question. And that's part of the reason I wanted to have you on, was just kind of like, because there's so many gray areas here. And I think there's a lot of scenarios that would fall under, categories of harassment or discrimination, or hostile environment, true threats. Another one that comes up a lot, and I don't think this one's a little harder to prove because it just has such a high bar, based on precedent, like with inciting violence. This is speech that incites violence. So it's just, can you kind of describe to our listeners like what actually it would need to look like to prove that speech is inciting violence?
For both threats and incitement to violence, I actually, even though I'm generally very pro free speech, the one major critique I have of Supreme Court doctrine on free speech is I think incitement to violence and threats are considered like the law that is much too narrow as to what constitutes these things.
Yeah.
And there's a historical reason for it, which is that incitement to violence and threatening behavior was used against civil rights activists in the South. And the Supreme Court wanted to take away that weapon by saying, well, you have to prove truly imminent threat. The threat has to be not just like, oh, your wife should be raped and your children should be murdered. That's not considered a true threat because you didn't say, I'm going to murder your wife and your children. But in any kind of decent society, that speech has really literally no value. The average person would find it threatening, right? And I don't think that should get constitutional protection. Certainly not in educational context, right? If one of your classmates says that to you, I think you're a woman at the school. You Zionist women should all be raped and your family's murdered. What is not, it's not, I guess it would not probably be considered true threat. It's not incitement, but why is that protected? It's just completely it's threatening speech that's not considered a true threat. Similarly with regard to incitement, the incitement has to be to imminent violence. Now there you don't want, if someone says globalize the intifada, that would not be considered incitement to violence. If they said, let's globalize the intifada right now, that would be considered a threat of imminent violence. But again, in the educational context, if you're saying globalize the intifada, which means we want worldwide terrorism against anyone we think is associated with Israel, that, at a public university that might still be constitutionally protected. I'm not sure that, even though I generally favor a culture of free speech, that a university couldn't say that's a bridge too far. Advocating murder of your classmates, basically, for whatever reason, doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be Jewish students. Advocating the murder of any of your fellow students by anybody is something that we just don't tolerate.
And this is just kind of been the big question. It's like, what's the difference between when people are saying that free speech is violence and then others are actually calling for violence? Like and this is where a lot of folks now, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are on this. Even before October 7th, those same groups that were saying free speech is violence were advocating for United States implementing hate speech laws. And obviously the Supreme Court has said time and time again that there's no hate speech or offensive speech exception to the First Amendment. And the reasons I imagine for that primarily are around discriminatory enforcement, that whoever's in charge of, like, how do you create a law where whoever's in charge of enforcing it would basically have to subjectively determine what hate is. But what are your concerns? Or, do you have any thoughts on just kind of like, do you think, one, is this going to lead politicians to advocating more now for hate speech laws? And two, do you think we should have them, or what are your kind of like general thoughts? Because just based on what you said about inciting violence and true threats, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, I would, I'll give you an example of something that I think the government could ban that is not currently banned. As you may recall, during the 2016 presidential campaign, there were some neo-Nazi type accounts that would take usually Jewish conservatives, ironically, who are never Trumpers or been critical of Trump, and they'd show pictures of them in a gas chamber. And my my perspective on this is, would that be unsettling enough to the common person to affect their daily life if they saw that? I would say, yeah, because that seems like someone really wants you dead, and that is enough of a threat to me that I wouldn't lock someone in jail for like 5 years for that, but I might very well be in favor of a law saying, we saw you did this. We want you to know that that you are not allowed to do that, and if you do it again, we're going to arrest you.
I mean, it does broach also another question. I mean, we can talk more about hate speech too, but like it does broach another question of internet speech, right? Like online speech, because one, it's most people don't have their actual legal names associated with their accounts, so it'd be a matter of proving that. Which obviously on the back end it could be proven if an investigation is launched, but publicly, I, as a viewer, so I think a really good example is this, for example. So, and this wasn't necessarily a legal question, this was more of how university reacted. At Georgetown University, Professor Christine Fair, I don't know if you're familiar with her, she tweeted during the Kavanaugh hearings that essentially, I think it was something to the extent of white conservative men should be killed and their bodies should be hung and castrated. As if you're a student in her class who happens to be a conservative white male, you're like, oh my gosh, my professor thinks this about me. And the question is, should that type of stuff be allowed? And obviously, there was defense of her, and she's still working to this day, and she was never fired. And you can square that off with how Elia Shapiro was treated at Georgetown. But the question comes down to, like, if it was online, was it directed at the students? If the students didn't know her account, would they have even known she said that? So there's all sorts of like online rhetoric stuff that we don't even have any precedent on. So kind of curious what your thoughts are on that too, because I know you just opened that door for us, but we don't have to go deep down. I know it's like a whole nother topic, but
sure. No, I mean, look, I do think there are things that you could say that are so call into question your ability to treat your students fairly that I could question whether you should be allowed to teach and grade them. However, because of this danger that you already mentioned, that these will not be applied fairly or reasonably, I would set a very high bar for that.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a student at University of Maryland, I think a grad student, who tweeted about how she intentionally downgrades Zionist students. So there's no question there, right?
That's discriminating.
This isn't expressing an opinion about Zionism. You're saying you're not going to treat your students fairly. This isn't like a free speech question. You're not able to, now that now let's say she had made it a little bit more moderate and said, I think most Zionist students are really moral reprobates, such that I have great difficulty and sometimes can't even treat them fairly. Yeah. Okay. That does call into question your ability to do your job, because your job is to actually grade all your students fairly. So again, I've set a pretty high bar for that, just because I think it could be abused. But objectively, I think they're like, putting aside the worry about abuse, there are certainly things you could say. I also want to say, I think there's two strategies with how to deal. The other David Bernstein and I are talking about this, and he's actually writing an article for my center at Scalia Law School about this. What is the right strategy when universities have double standards? And one strategy is to say, aha, you see you have double standards. That shows that your underlying policy is bad to begin with, because you can't enforce it properly. Get rid of the policy, get rid of the DEI offices, get rid of the harassment rules, and so forth and so on. The other strategy is make them live with their own policies. If a gay student complain or trans student complain about some microaggression, the whole DI thing goes into overdrive, but with Jewish students it doesn't. You need to go into overdrive for Jewish students too, and that will also undermine the policy, because they don't want to do that, because that hurts them ideologically. I actually think that both strategies should be pursued at the same time as a division of labor. Groups like David's, who are promoting liberal values, should be saying ultimately the outcome of this should be to have liberal values, and other groups that are dedicated to protecting the rights of Jewish students or civil rights more generally should say you have to treat Jewish students fairly, whatever your policies are. And both those things, and that puts pressure on the entire apparatus from two different sides. And I don't think you can only do the let's make things more liberal in the broad sense of the word side, because the problem is if you're treating Jewish students, if you say, well, Jewish students are protected, but we consider them part of the oppressor class, so we're just not going to treat them the same way we treat other minorities on campus, that is talk about dehumanization. That's just sending the signal that Jewish students somehow don't count. It's not simply like, if you say we're going to enforce, I won't go into that. That example is too controversial. And sort of a side point. Let me not go there. But there are two different things. What is the ideal policy in practice? Then second best, well, if we're not going to have the ideal policy, how should it be enforced? And it can't be that meanwhile, we're going to have all these rules about harassment and hate speech and microaggressions and emotional upset, and it applies to everyone except for Jews.
Right. Right. No, I think that it's a matter of not just moral clarity on the university's part, but obviously they lack serious clarity when it comes to their own policies. I think that's actually an excellent point that you brought up, and I'm looking forward to this article now because, there's no reason why we should have to choose what pressure points to push on for the DEI departments or kind of like this far left woke apparatus that exists on campus. There's plenty of pressure points, and like you said, calling them out on their double standards, forcing them to treat students equally is one very easily defendable position. But also telling them that their policies are total crap and and that they're targeting not only protected speech, but they're also confusing most students to the point where they don't even know like what their own rights are anymore because like they just think that they could constantly be accused of microaggressions. I think there's a lot that can be pointed out there when it comes to the lack of clarity. Do you have any kind of last additional thoughts? Because I think we can end here because I want to end on kind of advice and ways to kind of like solve the problem. So I would like to, so in addition to what you just mentioned, is there anything else that you want to kind of talk about on how campuses should be handling these issues, these incidents of anti-Semitism and all of these protesters? Because obviously they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, whether they want to be or not, whether they ever set out to have these double standards, or if they're just afraid of like the woke mob on campus, so they're just trying to constantly appease them. They're clearly in a situation where they are struggling to defend Jewish students on their campus, seriously struggling. And so I'm curious if you have any additional advice, even legal methods or practices that could be employed for the university leadership.
Funny you should ask that because I was actually just thinking about writing something today about this. So I think looking at all the incidents that I've seen on campus, a very large percentage of the most egregious incidents have involved people engaging in physical threats or violence or blocking people's way or whatever while wearing masks. And they say that they're wearing masks to protect their anonymity. And I think it's a very interesting question from a First Amendment perspective to what extent that the Constitution requires anonymity. Nevertheless, there's no reason that a private university can't ban students from wearing masks during organized protests or even disorganized protests for non-health reasons, and just say, you want to have your rally on campus, you have to show your identity. You can't be anonymous that way. Well, there's plenty of other ways that you could engage in anonymous speech without gathering in a crowd wearing usually masks. The keffiyeh is associated with Palestinian terrorists, chanting slogans, making people feel deathly afraid of you. The whole reason we've had policies in the past in this country and even today against mask wearing at demonstrations is because it's intimidating, right? If people in the KKK didn't go burning crosses without their hoods on because the fact that they're anonymous makes it that much more threatening. There are states like mine, Virginia, that have anti-masking laws that have been upheld against First Amendment challenges by the courts. So even public universities, they don't even have to make their own policy. They should just be enforcing the law. At my own university, I sent an email to the head of the relevant people in the police department saying, I understand you're not enforcing mask law. I understand people have asked you and you've declined because the SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, has promised that their protests will be peaceful. I said that may have been, I don't know how that means you shouldn't enforce the law, but maybe that was a defensible position a month ago. But since then, there have been all these violent incidents on campus and off involving mass demonstrators, and you need to enforce this because otherwise you're giving students a feeling of impunity and you're opening the possibility of violence. And then a few days later, there was actually a violent incident on my campus where a few SJP students attacked a student who was holding like a pro-Israel flag. So I think that, all the other legal strategies, you can go on and on about all different things, but the easiest thing to do, and I think something that would not violate academic freedom, would not violate free speech rights on campus, would not, in states where it's been upheld against constitutional challenge, would not even be illegal in public universities. They just say, if you're in a group of more than, say, 5 people, you can't hide your identity.
That's really interesting because you're right. There are a number of state laws that already exist in wearing masks in the commission of a crime. Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be said. That's really interesting advice. I'd be curious to see if Mason or any other schools take that on.
I should say the Attorney General of Virginia, I discovered just on the 16th, I guess that's 5 days ago, sent a letter out about universities' obligations with regard to anti-Semitism. And one thing he said was that you have a mask law, you're supposed to be enforcing it.
That's amazing. So yeah, now I'm very curious to see if Mason.
I don't know if they'll obey it or not. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see if they obey it. I mean, there are plenty of things universities think that they're immune to, but we'll see. We'll see if Mason does it, because I think that they've got you there and they've got some other pressure points on campus. Hopefully that can be encouraging. I'm actually Mason is my alma mater for undergrad, so
okay.
Yeah, I'm a
patriot.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just like, it's kind of sad. I was hoping that they'd come out stronger on this one, but yeah, it seems like they're kind of following suit, unfortunately. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I think this has been a really insightful discussion. There's certainly more to talk about. I look forward to having David back on the show again, and when discussing some of these really kind of honestly complicated legal questions, because it's not like there's a whole lot of precedent on this front that's clear. And like you said, there's still a lot of stuff that one could argue is too narrow in the way the Supreme Court has interpreted certain things. So I think it's very interesting for just kind of like a theoretical legal discussion, and we should continue to have it. Obviously debate and discussion are so key to education, and we will agree with that on campuses. But thank you again, David, for coming on. I'm Cherise Trump, and David, that was well said.